Welcome to Sinister Black Echoes, where we'll share horror stories that make your skin crawl. Today we have 3 true stories that proves there's no age limit to experience terrifying things. All 3 stories are about young girls faces dangerous individuals who had bad intentions. Stay tuned to find out what happened to them. So yesterday I was at my sister's house with my mom watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said, "So weird," out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mom inquired what I was talking about, so I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at the pinecone forest, which was what the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off of one of the trees to pass some time waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out to play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of scared when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and said hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin." "How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come and wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time. When I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said that it's probably time I know the whole story. She thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a small tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? She didn't recognize it, but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it. She said she just had a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. That was when she called me into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, at my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom, just me everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit, they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher cleaver, a thin flay knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There were also a few anatomy books, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps. And the entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. My mom said he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, last she heard.
Enjoying the story so far? Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating content like this. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on the latest adventures and terrifying tales. Thank you for your support.
The following account occurred roughly 3 years ago, during the summer of 2012. It has always been difficult for me to talk about, but I have found writing about it to be therapeutic. I was 17 at the time, and I had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s/early 50s, probably 6 feet 5 inches, and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered, and he had a long beard. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in the area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Toiletries and things like that, yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items, and he paid with crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked, "You cook, too?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, Mom's friend/boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods he claimed he built with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he bought at the store. Over time our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time, he even said I had the birthing hips that men lust after. Shudder. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc., and I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her, and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it was late, around 10 at night. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only 2 cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. But I didn't see him in the lot, just his car, so I walked quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't urinate myself. I didn't even want to look because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad is on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed. "No, he's not," he said. "Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "Leave me alone." Suddenly he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now, or I'm calling the cops," I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher. And I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here, that could be a while. "The cops are on their way. Leave now," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let it deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful he would leave me alone. But then he started walking back toward me, with a crowbar in hand. "No!" I screamed at him. "Get the fuck away from me!" He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on the way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away, and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his medication and his issues were only getting worse. My cousin Luke is a cop, and later on, he told me some more about the case that he had heard about through some other officers. The police did a search of the cabin after the incident, to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. They found a journal that Mountain Man kept. Apparently, in it he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot, stupid name tag, and Luke said there were a lot of lewd things in there about me that he didn't want to share, but tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, he has been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good. Mountain Man, let's not meet again.
Now on to the third and last story.
I've shared a few stories on here before, but this is the one that bothers me the most. It happened years ago, when I was about 13 or 14. When I was a young teenager, back in the fall of 2006, me, my family, and my neighbors started having bizarre encounters with an old man in a dark red minivan. Back then, I used to live on a hill above an old non-operational fishing village. It was about a 40-minute drive outside of the city along a highway. The highway to the village was a dead end. There was nothing down that way, except housing. There weren't even motels or any stores. Most of the houses were homes to elderly people, while the others were abandoned fishing stages that overlooked the water. It was very strange to see anyone that we didn't recognize down in the area, especially from September till May. We would get the odd tourist during the summer months, but never from fall to spring. When I was in middle school, every day after I got home off the bus, I would walk up to the mailbox. It was about a good 15-minute walk along the highway. The mailbox was up the road, towards the city. Past my house, there was only about 8 other houses, all on the same side of the road as mine. After those houses, it was just thick trees and marshes. I used to like to call the area Silentville instead of Silent Hill. We were right on the very edge of the East Coast, right by the ocean. It was a fog bank all year round. It was rare we would get sunny days. Even when it was sunny in the city, it was still foggy down there. Sometimes the fog was so thick, you barely see a few feet ahead of you. Anyway, one afternoon after school, while I was on my usual trek back home after checking the mailbox, I heard the rattling of a vehicle in the distance. I always walked facing traffic, since my mother would have a fit if I didn't. Safety rules and all. It was crawling towards me, its headlights clearing the fog. It was probably going about 5 miles per hour, which was odd considering the speed limit was about 70. The minivan came to a halt about 10 feet ahead of me. Just stopped, right in the middle of the highway. I continued towards it. I figured it was someone looking for directions. As I neared the window of the car, I could see an old man sitting in the driver's seat. He was of a fairly small build, with light gray patches of hair on his head. His eyes were very watery, and of a dull blue color. "Hello, young lady," he said in a very soft voice. "Hi," I responded. He started making small chat with me. I really can't remember what, but it was just sort of casual talking. I noticed he had a small fluffy white dog in his passenger seat. The thing that really struck me odd about this dog was its body language. You see, this old man would move his hand a lot while talking. Every time he would quickly move it, his dog would sort of scrunch further back in its seat. It seemed a bit afraid of him. Another thing odd was, he always kept his other hand between the two seats. I could sort of make out what seemed to be something of a metallic material under his hand. After chatting with me a bit, he slowly turned his head away, then continued up the road towards the city. I shrugged it off, just figuring he was a relative of someone down in the village, and continued home. About a week went by without seeing him, and by then, he was just a memory. I was on my way up to the mailbox when I heard the familiar sound of rattling coming down the roads towards me. Him again, I thought. I was a little weirded out by him, so I jumped down into the ditch and hid in the brush. I watched as he sluggishly drove by. The entire time, he was looking around, observing. Sort of like a hunter looking for prey. After he was long out of sight, and I couldn't hear his vehicle anymore, I jumped up from the ditch and hurried my way up to the mailbox. The last 6-minute stretch of road had no housing, so it was pretty isolated. After snatching up the mail, I started hurrying back, and that is when I ran into him again, in the worst place possible, the long stretch with no houses. This time, he was coming up the road, quite fast. I didn't have time to hide. He pulled up next to me, and said, "Hello dearie, why were you down in the ditch earlier?" Oh shit, I thought, he had seen me. "Oh, I thought I had seen a cat down there," I said. "You like cute animals, dearie? You can get in the back seat and play with my puppy." "She loves kids," he said, smiling. No thanks," I said, as I started to walk away. He reached out of his window and grabbed my arm. "Please dearie, I insist. I can drive you home. You live at my address, right?" I stood there dumbfounded. How did he know which house I lived in? I shook him off and started to run. He started backing his car up after me. I bolted down the road and didn't look back. At the time, my aunt lived a few houses up the road from my house, so I ran into her driveway and started frantically banging on her door. She came to the door and let me in. I used her phone and called my mother to come pick me up. After we got home, I told her everything. She was very upset and called the police. They basically told us they couldn't do anything, especially since we didn't have a license plate number. After that, I wasn't allowed to go on walks. He continued to show up. Usually twice a week, right after my school bus dropped me off, he would come driving slowly down the road. One day my neighbor asked him what he was doing. He responded, "Oh, I'm just a lonely gentleman. I saw a woman one day down the road working on her garden, and she just captured my heart." My neighbor told him she was married. He just laughed and said something along the lines of, "If you want love to work, you have to work for it," then drove off. My neighbor got the license plate and called the police. About 40 minutes later, the police came down, but he was long gone by then. Our neighbor waved the police over and talked to them. They told him the car had been reported stolen a few months back. Sometime during November, my parents were out in the evening doing yard work. He stopped in front of our yard and was asking my parents where I was. He said he missed our time together and felt neglected. My parents got really upset and chased him away. A few days later, I was up late at night playing FFXI on the Xbox 360 in the den. The den was on the bottom floor. I used to keep all the blinds open with the lights off in the room. I liked looking at the night sky. People could probably see me through the window since it was facing the street. So there I was, illuminated by the TV, all cuddled up in my big armchair having a late-night game session, probably about 2 a.m., and I see the familiar red minivan slowly coming down the road. I froze. It parked a few feet up the road from my property, in between our house and the house next door. There was a small driveway that led to nowhere, going in between our land. He stopped his car, turned it off, then came out. I watched in horror as he walked closer to our house. I was terrified. I pushed myself as far back into the chair as I could, hoping he wouldn't see me. I felt like screaming, but my parents were upstairs, and both were sound sleepers. He paced back and forth in front of our house, sort of staring. He was looking into the den. Now, this is the extremely strange part. He just stopped in place, then laid down on the side of the road in front of our house. He just laid there for a good hour. I was frozen with fear the entire time. After about an hour, he got up, then strolled back to his car, and left. I ran upstairs crying and told my parents. They called the police again, but he was gone by the time they got to us. We were all frustrated. The police, despite having his license plate, couldn't do anything, and this guy was coming around, harassing, and terrifying us and our neighbors. This went on till about March. About a month passed without seeing him. And that is when we got the news. Our neighbor, who was good friends with someone that lived down a dead-end side road up a bit further, had been on a walk to his friend's house. He spotted the red minivan off in a driveway of a house that had just been put up for sale. The people were moved out. He got filled with anger when seeing it and ran over. When he got closer, he noticed blood on the passenger side window. He went to the closest house and used their phone to call 911. He went back over to the car to check it out. He was pretty ballsy. He was sort of the neighborhood protector. The car doors were unlocked. He looked in the window to see the small dog's body, a wallet, which had an ID in it, and a bloody wrench wedged between the two seats. He left and waited for the police to arrive. Our neighbor stayed in contact with the police. Apparently, the guy had left in a hurry, leaving his ID behind. Turns out he had just been released from prison not too long ago for offenses towards minors. We didn't get any details though. I felt so horrible for the dog. I really hope he never got his hands on another animal again. I sometimes worry that he went on to harass other people the same way he harassed us.
And that wraps up this video. The moral of these stories: be careful and keep an eye out, you never know who is watching you. To all of you who have followed along on this journey, thank you for joining us in this adventure. If you would like to hear more in the future, please like and subscribe. Your support and enthusiasm mean the world to us. Until next time.